The morning mist rose from Willow Creek like the breath of something dead, carrying with it the metallic taste of old blood that locals swore returned every spring. It was April 15th, 1850, and Martha Whitmore stood at the edge of the water, her bare feet sinking into mud that seemed too red, too thick for ordinary earth. She'd been married exactly 7 days. 7 days since she'd walked down the aisle of the small Baptist church in Louisville, her father's calloused hand guiding her toward a future he'd sold for the price of his gambling debts. 7 days since she'd become Mrs. Jeremiah Blackwood, wife to one of Kentucky's wealthiest tobacco plantation owners. And 7 days since she'd learned what kind of man her new husband truly was. The Blackwood plantation stretched across 3,000 acres of prime Kentucky soil, its boundaries marked by rows of ancient oak trees that seemed to lean away from the main house, as if nature itself recoiled from what happened there. The mansion rose from the landscape like a white-columned monument to cruelty, its grand facade hiding secrets that would make the devil himself weep. Martha adjusted the high collar of her dress, trying to hide the purple fingerprints that ringed her throat like a necklace of shame. At 19, she had been considered one of Louisville's most promising young ladies, educated, well-mannered, and possessed of a fierce intelligence that her father had viewed as more curse than blessing. "A woman's mind is like a wild horse," he'd told her the night before the wedding. "It needs a firm hand to break it proper." Jeremiah Blackwood was 43 years old and had buried 2 wives already, both lost to what the local doctor politely termed unfortunate accidents. The first had supposedly fallen down the main staircase during a thunderstorm. The second had drowned in the very creek where Martha now stood, her body found floating face down among the cattails on a peaceful summer morning, with no explanation for how she'd ended up in the water. But it wasn't her husband's violence that made Martha's skin crawl with revulsion. It was his overseer. Silas Kane stood 6 feet 4 inches tall and weighed nearly 300 pounds. His massive frame carrying the kind of muscle that came from years of brutal labor and even more brutal authority. His face was a patchwork of scars, souvenirs from his days as a bare-knuckle fighter in the river towns before Blackwood had hired him to manage the plantation's 130 enslaved workers. Kane's eyes were the color of dirty ice, and when he looked at Martha, she felt something fundamental inside her recoil, like a small animal sensing a predator. The slaves called him Devil's Hand in whispers they thought no one could hear, but Martha heard everything. She'd made it her business to listen, to watch, to understand the true nature of the place she'd been sold into. And what she learned in those first 7 days of marriage made her understand that hell wasn't some distant realm of fire and brimstone. Hell was right here in Kentucky, wearing a human face and carrying a whip. Kane took pleasure in his work in ways that went beyond mere cruelty. Martha had watched from her bedroom window as he selected his victims with the care of a connoisseur choosing wine. A young woman who'd caught his eye would find herself called to the overseer's cabin for special duties. A man who'd shown too much spirit would discover creative new forms of punishment that left scars in places no doctor would ever examine. And Jeremiah Blackwood not only knew about Kane's methods, he encouraged them. "Fear keeps them productive," he'd told Martha over breakfast on their 4th morning as husband and wife, his voice carrying the casual indifference of a man discussing the weather. "Silas understands that sometimes you have to break a few bones to keep the rest in line." Martha had excused herself from the table and vomited in the rose bushes. But it was what happened on the 7th night that finally broke something inside her that could never be repaired. The screaming had started just after midnight, drifting across the plantation grounds like smoke from a distant fire. Martha had been lying in her marriage bed, staring at the ceiling while her husband snored beside her when the sound reached her ears. It was a woman's voice, young and desperate, calling out in a language Martha recognized as the African tongue. Some of the older slaves still spoke in moments of extreme distress. Martha had slipped from bed and crept to the window, her bare feet silent on the cold wooden floor. In the moonlight, she could see the overseer's cabin, its windows glowing with lamplight. The screaming grew louder, then suddenly stopped, cut off with an abruptness that made Martha's heart hammer against her ribs like a caged bird. She'd thrown on her robe and slippers, moving through the house like a ghost, past portraits of dead Blackwoods, whose painted eyes seemed to follow her progress. The front door's lock opened with a soft click, and she'd stepped into the night air, following a path she'd never walked, but somehow knew by heart. The overseer's cabin sat at the edge of the slave quarters, deliberately positioned so Cain could observe his domain like a spider in the center of its web. As Martha approached, she could hear voices from within, Cain's deep rumble punctuated by whimpering that made her stomach turn to ice. Through a gap in the curtains, she saw them. Cain had a girl stretched across his table, no more than 16 years old, her dark skin gleaming with sweat in the lamplight. The girl's wrists were bound with rope that had already cut deep enough to leave permanent scars, and her eyes held the glazed look of someone whose mind had retreated to some safer place, while her body endured the unendurable. But it wasn't just assault Martha witnessed. Cain was cutting symbols into the girl's back with a knife heated in his fireplace, symbols that looked older than Christianity, older than civilization itself. As each mark was carved into her flesh, Cain spoke words in a language that sounded like rocks grinding against each other, ancient and full of power. The girl was named Mercy, Martha learned later. She was the daughter of two of the plantation's most skilled workers, a bright child who'd been teaching herself to read using a Bible she'd found in the big house's library. She'd committed no crime except catching the attention of a monster. Martha watched for perhaps 10 minutes, paralyzed by horror and her own helplessness. Then Khan had looked up from his work and smiled directly at the window where she stood hidden, his dirty ice eyes finding hers with impossible accuracy in the darkness. "Come in, Mrs. Blackwood," he'd called, his voice carrying easily through the thin cabin walls. "I know you're out there watching. Come in and see what real power looks like." Martha had run then, her slippers slapping against the packed earth as she fled back to the main house, her heart threatening to burst from terror and shame. She'd climbed back into bed beside her sleeping husband, pulled the covers over her head, and wept silently until dawn. The next morning, Mercy was found dead in the creek. The official cause was drowning, of course. The local sheriff, a man whose gambling debts to Jeremiah Blackwood exceeded his annual salary, ruled it suicide. "These people get melancholy sometimes," he'd explained to Martha with the casual indifference of someone discussing livestock, especially the young ones. "Can't handle the responsibility of civilized living." But Martha had seen Mercy's body before they'd wrapped her in canvas and thrown her into the ground without ceremony. She'd seen the symbols carved into the girl's back, symbols that had continued to bleed long after death should have stopped the flow. And she'd seen something else, something that made her understand that Silas Cain wasn't just a cruel man with strange hobbies. He was something far worse. The revelation came to her in pieces over the following weeks, assembled from whispered conversations between the oldest slaves and fragments of journal entries she'd found hidden in her husband's study. The Blackwood plantation hadn't always been successful. When Jeremiah's grandfather had first cleared the land in 1798, crop after crop had failed, livestock had sickened and died, and workers had fled rather than endure the strange illnesses that seemed to plague anyone who stayed too long. Then in 1805, the grandfather had hired a new overseer, a man who'd arrived in Kentucky from somewhere further south, somewhere he never spoke about in polite company. Within a year, the plantation had become the most profitable in the county. The tobacco grew taller and stronger than anywhere else in the state. The workers, while occasionally losing a member to accidents, were remarkably healthy and productive. And the Blackwood family had begun their rise to prominence in Kentucky society. The overseer's name had been Silas Kane. Martha had stared at the faded daguerreotype in her husband's study, trying to comprehend what she was seeing. The man in the picture was identical to the current overseer, down to the pattern of scars on his face and the cold intelligence in his ice-colored eyes. Not similar, identical. The same man who had carved symbols into a 16-year-old girl's back was the same man who had worked for the Blackwood family for 45 years without aging a single day. That night, Martha had gone to the slave quarters. She'd waited until well past midnight, when even the most restless souls had settled into sleep, then made her way through the darkness to the row of cabins where the field hands lived. Her destination was the cabin of an ancient woman named Aunt Phyllis, who everyone said remembered stories from before the crossing, from the old country across the water. Phyllis had been waiting for her. "Child," the old woman had whispered, her voice like dry leaves rustling in an autumn wind. "I've been expecting you since the day you set foot on this cursed ground. Come in quickly before he feels you moving through his web." The cabin was tiny, barely large enough for a bed and a small table, but it felt safer than any place Martha had been since her wedding day. Phyllis had gestured for her to sit on the room's only chair while the old woman lowered herself onto the bed with joints that cracked like breaking wood. "You've seen him for what he is, haven't you?" Phyllis had asked, her dark eyes reflecting the candle flame like deep water. "Seen past the man-shape he wears like a coat?" Martha had nodded, not trusting her voice. "He ain't human, child. Ain't been human for longer than this country's had a name. He's what my grandmother's grandmother would have called a flesh walker, something that learned how to wear bodies like you'd wear dresses, trying them on and casting them off when they wore out or stopped serving his purpose." "But he's been here for decades," Martha had whispered. "The same face, the same body." "That body serves him well," Phyllis had replied. "Strong enough for the work he does, feared enough to keep folks in line, but it ain't really his body, you understand. It's stolen, just like everything else about him. And the things he does, the marks he carves, the words he speaks, they're feeding something older and hungrier than your worst nightmares." Martha had felt something cold settle in her stomach. "What is he feeding?" "Something that sleeps in the deep places," Phyllis had said, her voice dropping to barely above a breath. "Something that dreams of the time before men walked upright, before the sun burned away the first darkness. Every soul he takes, every symbol he carves, every drop of innocent blood he spills, it all goes to keep that thing sleeping. Because the day it wakes up, child, is the day the world ends." "Why doesn't someone stop him?" Phyllis had laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Stop him with what? Bullets can't kill what ain't alive to begin with. Law can't touch what owns the men who make the laws. And prayer." She'd shaken her head sadly. "Child, the things he serves are older than any god we know how to call on." Martha had left the cabin with more questions than answers, but with one certainty burning in her heart like a coal from hell's own forge. Whatever Silas Kane was, whatever he served, he had to be stopped. And if bullets and laws and prayers couldn't touch him, she'd find something that could. The answer came to her 3 weeks later in her husband's private study. Jeremiah kept his most important papers in a locked drawer of his desk, documents he assumed his young wife was too ignorant to understand, even if she could somehow access them. But Martha had learned to pick locks from her older brother before he died of consumption, and she'd learned to read Latin from her childhood governess before her father had decided education was wasted on daughters. The documents were contracts, written in a mixture of English and Latin so archaic it hurt her eyes to decipher. But the meaning was clear enough. Each generation of Blackwood men had renewed an agreement with something called the Sleeper Beneath, offering it regular sacrifices in exchange for prosperity and protection. The contracts were signed in blood, witnessed by Silas Kane, and sealed with symbols that matched the ones Martha had seen carved into Mercy's back. But there was something else in the papers, a clause her father-in-law had apparently insisted upon when he'd inherited the plantation, an escape clause, a way to break the contract if the situation ever became untenable. The knowledge of how to banish the entity serving as overseer was written in the margins of the original agreement, apparently added by someone who'd wanted future generations to have a choice their ancestors had been denied. The ritual was simple in concept, terrifying in execution. The overseer could be destroyed, but only by someone who met 3 specific conditions. They had to be innocent of the blood contract, they had to act out of pure intention rather than personal gain, and they had to be willing to sacrifice their own life force to power the banishment. Martha had folded the papers carefully and returned them to their locked drawer, her hands steady despite the magnitude of what she'd learned. She met all 3 conditions. She was innocent, having played no role in the evil that had sustained the plantation's prosperity. Her intentions were pure, motivated by justice for the dead and protection for the living, and she was more than willing to die if it meant ending the horror she'd witnessed. The only question was how to get close enough to Cain to perform the ritual without being stopped. The answer to that question came 2 days later, when her husband announced that he'd be traveling to Lexington on business, leaving Martha alone on the plantation for a full week. "Silas will keep an eye on things while I'm gone," Jeremiah had told her over breakfast, his tone suggesting this was meant to be reassuring rather than terrifying. "You're not to leave the main house after dark, you understand. There are dangerous men in these parts, and I won't have my wife putting herself at risk." Martha had nodded obediently, playing the role of the submissive wife while her mind raced with possibilities. A week alone with Cain meant a week of opportunity, but it also meant a week during which she'd be completely at the mercy of something that viewed mercy as a weakness to be exploited. She'd spent the 3 days before her husband's departure in careful preparation. The ritual required specific materials, most of which she was able to gather from the plantation's herb garden and the surrounding woods. Sacred salt could be made from creek water evaporated under a full moon. Iron filings could be scraped from the hinges of doors that had never known violence. And the words of banishment could be memorized from the margins of her husband's contracts, practiced in the silence of her bedroom until they flowed from her tongue like water. The most difficult requirement was timing. The ritual had to be performed during the dark of the moon, when the veil between worlds was thinnest and the overseer's connection to his supernatural patron was most vulnerable. Martha had consulted her almanac and found that the new moon would fall exactly 4 days into her husband's absence, giving her time to overcome Cain's suspicions and position herself for what might be her only chance. Jeremiah left on a Tuesday morning, kissing his wife goodbye, with all the affection of a man bidding farewell to a piece of furniture. Martha waved from the front porch until his carriage disappeared around the bend in the road, then walked calmly back into the house and began her preparations for war. The first phase of her plan was psychological. For 3 days, she played the role of the frightened, lonely wife, jumping at shadows and requesting Cain's protection for imaginary threats. She asked him to check the locks on her windows each evening, to walk the grounds around the main house after dark, to investigate strange noises that existed only in her performance of fear. Cain had played along, his cold eyes watching her with the patience of a cat studying a mouse. He'd been polite, even solicitous, calling her ma'am and touching his hat brim when she addressed him. But Martha could see the hunger beneath his courtesy, the way his gaze lingered on her throat when she bent to tend her flowers, the way he positioned himself to block her path when she tried to move past him in narrow hallways. On the 4th night, the night of the new moon, Martha had made her final preparations. She'd dressed carefully, choosing a simple white dress that would show blood clearly if things went wrong. She'd braided her long, dark hair to keep it out of her face during what was to come, and she'd sewn the materials for the ritual into hidden pockets throughout her clothing, iron filings in her left sleeve, sacred salt in her right, the written words of banishment tucked into her bodice where they rested against her heart like a paper shield. Just after midnight, She'd walked out to the overseer's cabin. Cain had been waiting for her, of course. He'd probably been waiting since the moment her husband's carriage had left the plantation, counting down the days until he could claim his prize. The cabin door had stood open despite the cool night air, and warm light had spilled out onto the dirt path like an invitation to damnation. "Mrs. Blackwood," Cain had said as she'd approached, his voice carrying that grinding quality that made her skin crawl. "I was wondering when you'd work up the courage to visit me properly." Martha had stopped just outside the circle of light from his doorway, keeping herself positioned exactly where the ritual required her to be. "I couldn't sleep," she'd said, putting a tremor in her voice that wasn't entirely feigned. "I keep thinking about poor Mercy, about what happened to her." "Do you now?" Cain had stepped out of the cabin, his massive frame blocking out the stars. "And what exactly do you think happened to little Mercy?" "She drowned," Martha had replied carefully. "That's what everyone says." "That's what everyone says," Cain had agreed, moving closer with the fluid grace of something that had learned to walk upright but hadn't forgotten how to move like a predator. "But we both know you were watching that night, don't we? We both know you saw what really happened to her." Martha had forced herself to take a step backward, playing the role of the cornered victim while actually positioning herself more precisely for what was to come. "I don't know what you mean." "Don't you?" Cain had smiled, revealing teeth that were too sharp and too numerous for any human mouth. "Then let me refresh your memory." He'd begun to change then, his carefully maintained human appearance melting away like wax in a fire. His skin had grown pale and translucent, showing the dark network of veins beneath. His eyes had expanded until they dominated his face, becoming black pools that reflected no light. And his hands had elongated into something between fingers and claws, tipped with nails that curved like scythe blades. "This is what I really am," the thing wearing Silas Cain's name had hissed, its voice now carrying harmonics no human throat could produce. "This is what your family has been feeding for 50 years, and now it's time for you to join that feast." Martha had waited until it was close enough to touch her, close enough that she could smell the decay that clung to its borrowed flesh like perfume. Then she'd begun the ritual. The words of banishment had poured from her lips in Latin so old it predated the Roman Empire, syllables that tasted of copper and ashes. As she'd spoken, she'd pulled the sacred salt from her sleeve, casting it in a circle around both herself and the creature that had once been Cain. The salt had hit the ground with a sound like breaking glass, each grain glowing with its own cold light. Cain had realized what was happening and lunged for her, but the salt circle had held him like chains. His claws had scraped against an invisible barrier, sending sparks of blue fire cascading through the air. "You don't know what you're doing," he'd screamed, his voice breaking apart into multiple tones. "You can't banish me. I have a contract. I have protection." "Your contract is void," Martha had replied, continuing the ritual even as her strength had begun to drain away like water from a broken pitcher. "It was signed by men who are dead, witnessed by something that was never alive, and sealed with the blood of the innocent. All contracts written in evil are null before the light of justice." She'd thrown the iron filings then, the metal fragments forming a second circle inside the first, this one designed to contain rather than repel. The creature had shrieked as the iron had touched the boundary of its prison, its borrowed form beginning to blur and shift like smoke in a strong wind. "The sleeper will wake," it had warned, its voice already growing distant as the banishment had taken hold. "Without my service, without the regular feeding, it will wake and the world will burn." "Then let it wake," Martha had replied, speaking the final words of the ritual with the last of her strength. "Let it face a world where things like you can no longer hide in human skin. Let it discover that some evils create their own destruction." The creature had imploded then, its borrowed flesh and stolen years collapsing in on themselves with a sound like reality tearing. For a moment, Martha had seen its true form, something made of hunger and shadow and teeth that had never known human warmth. Then it had been gone, leaving only a charred circle in the earth and the smell of sulfur hanging in the night air. Martha had collapsed then, the ritual having drawn more life force from her than she'd expected. She'd felt her heart stuttering in her chest like a broken clock, her vision going dark around the edges. But she'd also felt something else, a lightness that had nothing to do with blood loss. For the first time since her wedding day, the air around the plantation had tasted clean. She'd crawled back to the main house on her hands and knees, leaving a trail of blood from wounds she couldn't remember receiving. By the time she'd reached her bedroom, dawn had been breaking over the Kentucky hills, painting the sky the color of hope. Martha had lived for 3 more days. She'd used that time to write letters, detailed accounts of everything she'd witnessed and everything she'd done. She'd sent 1 letter to the Louisville newspaper, another to the county sheriff, and a 3rd to her sister in Virginia. She'd documented the location of mass graves hidden throughout the plantation grounds, the names of victims she'd been able to identify, and instructions for finding the ritual materials needed to keep the banishment permanent. On the 3rd day, Jeremiah had returned from Lexington to find his wife dying in their marriage bed, her face peaceful despite the blood that stained her pillow. "What happened to Silas?" he'd demanded, shaking her weakened form. "Where is my overseer?" "Gone," Martha had whispered, using the last of her voice to speak the truth he'd never be able to change. "Banished back to whatever hell spawned him. The contract is broken, Jeremiah. The protection is gone. You're just a man now, with man's justice coming for you." Jeremiah had raged and threatened, but Martha had closed her eyes and let her spirit drift free, secure in the knowledge that she'd accomplished what she'd set out to do. The last thing she'd heard was the sound of horses approaching the main house, the Louisville sheriff arriving with questions that would destroy the Blackwood family's carefully constructed lies. Martha Whitmore Blackwood had died at sunset on April 15, 1850, exactly 1 month after her wedding day. Her body had been found in Willow Creek the next morning, officially ruled a suicide by the same sheriff who'd covered up so many deaths before. But this time, the official story hadn't mattered. The letters Martha had sent had reached their destinations, and her sister in Virginia had proven to be a woman of considerable influence and implacable determination. Within weeks, federal investigators had descended on the Blackwood plantation, armed with Martha's detailed accusations and the authority to dig up every inch of ground she'd identified. They'd found the graves, dozens of them, containing the remains of enslaved workers who died of accidents too numerous and too creative to be anything but murder. They'd found Kane's cabin, its walls still marked with symbols that made grown men cross themselves and mutter prayers. And they'd found Jeremiah's contracts, locked in his desk drawer, exactly where Martha had described them. Jeremiah Blackwood had been hanged for murder in Louisville on October 13, 1850, still protesting his innocence even as the rope had been fitted around his neck. The plantation had been seized by the federal government, and its enslaved population had been freed, making it one of the first properties in Kentucky to be forcibly emancipated before the Civil War. But the strangest part of the story had been what happened to Willow Creek. Every spring since 1850, when the snow melt had swelled the water level, the creek had run red for exactly 7 days. Not the rusty red of iron deposits or the muddy red of disturbed soil, but the bright crimson red of fresh blood. Water samples had been tested by chemists from as far away as Boston, but no scientific explanation had ever been found for the phenomenon. The locals had their own explanation, of course. They said it was Martha's blood, renewed each year as a reminder of the price she'd paid to free them all from an evil that had worn a human face. They said, if you stood by the creek during those 7 red days and listened carefully, you could hear her voice carried on the water, still speaking the words of banishment that kept the darkness at bay. Children born in the area learned early not to drink from Willow Creek during its bleeding time, and adults made sure to be indoors after sunset during those 7 days in April. Not because they feared Martha's spirit, but because they feared what might happen if her sacrifice were somehow undone, if the banishment she died to create were ever broken. The Blackwood plantation had been abandoned after the federal seizure, its fields left to grow wild, its buildings left to decay. But Willow Creek had remained, flowing red each spring like a wound that refused to heal, carrying its burden of memory and warning toward whatever destiny awaited it downstream. And on quiet nights, when the moon was dark and the wind was still, people swore they could hear something else in the water's voice, not Martha's words of banishment, but something answering from deep beneath the earth, something that had been sleeping for 70 years and was beginning to dream of waking. The locals who heard that deeper voice made sure to keep their doors locked and their children close, understanding that some victories were temporary, some sleepers eventually stirred, and some prices were paid not once but again and again, by each generation brave enough to stand against the darkness when it came calling. Martha Whitmore had saved them all, but her story was far from over. It lived on in the red creek that bore witness to her sacrifice, in the empty plantation that stood as monument to her courage, and in the watchful eyes of those who understood that evil never truly dies. It only waits for the next chance to wear a human face and walk among the innocent once again. The creek still runs red each spring, just as it has for 173 years. And those who know the true story of Martha and the thing that called itself Silas Cain make sure to remember that some stains never wash clean, some prices never stop being paid, and some battles must be fought by each generation in turn. Because the darkness is always waiting, and it never forgets the taste of innocent blood.